Hello, everyone, and welcome to a late night author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we have a first timer making her official debut here on the channel. My guest is a West Coaster who spends her time hiking and exploring all the richness of the island she lives on. With a profound love of fairy tales and all things witchy, she draws her inspiration from the nature around her, allowing it to bleed into her storytelling. She always seeks new adventures and places to explore in life or writing. When she isn't traversing all Vancouver Island has to offer, she can be found with a cup of coffee, either reading a book or writing one. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, author Sabrina Voerman. Sabrina, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here and discuss things with you. I'm really excited to talk about everything.
Awesome, Sabrina. So before we dive into your book, Bloodbound, is there anything else you'd like to add about your bio, your background, anything else that wasn't mentioned?
I mean, I cover it pretty well. I'm a very simple person. I like my books, I like my coffee, and I like my hiking. I like perusing cemeteries, so pretty much covers it. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I don't do a whole lot outside of that scope, and I think that's a good lifestyle for a writer.
Nice. Now, since this is your first time on the show, would you like to give our viewers and listeners a little teaser about your book series, Bloodbound?
Yeah, so the Bloodbound series is a dark fantasy fairy tale retelling series of four. Blood Coven is the first book. It is a Red Riding Hood retelling, very dark, kind of dates back to the way the Grimm stories were told, where they didn't
Ooh,
shy away
okay.
from, yeah, from the darker side of life and all that comes with that. The second book is Ashen Heart. It is a evil queen Snow White retelling, very, very loosely based on that, heavily inspired by Elizabeth Bathory.
Ooh, okay.
And then upcoming in December is Song of the Sea, which is a Little Mermaid retelling where Prince Eric eats Ariel.
Okay, now that I'm hearing this, I'm really, really regretting and a little mad at myself that I did not get you early for October because you would have been perfect for three other authors that I had: Raven White, Raven Velasco, Stephanie Kelmer. You four would have been perfect for the October lineup. Darn it, why didn't I think of that before? But I may do a special with just you four to talk about Gothic literature and writing, dark fantasy, because I would love to hear your guys' perspectives on that. So definitely a future video in mind. But definitely speaking of, retellings and, inspirations and fairy tales, Sabrina, what can you tell us about your childhood growing up? Were you always a creative person or did that come later?
I think I was a creative person. I kind of grew up on that cusp of I didn't have internet for a very long time. So I had to
Mm.
be creative in the forest and we had acreage growing up. So there was a lot of playing in the woods and stories. And I mean, we grew up with bears in the backyard. So it kind of bears just kind of give that fairy tale vibe, right? So, and I think we all grow up listening to fairy tales in some capacity, whether it's a Disney film or the stories your parents read to you before bed. So it's so ingrained in us and it has such a it's so deeply rooted in our moral compass and our ethics and what we learn growing up. So I think I've always been a creative person. I recall writing little short stories or drawing comics all throughout elementary school and diving into short stories and then eventually novels throughout middle and high school. So that creative thread has always been with me, and as an adult you kind of realize you're able to take it outside of the laptop. or Wattpad.
Definitely. Now, what was sort of the aha moment for you when you decided to take a chance and create your own series of novels? Can you tell us about that process?
It was a long, long process. I wrote the first book, which was Blood Coven. It had a different name, many, many names. It was probably 10,000 words. It was inspired by one idea, one photograph, or not even a photograph. I think it was a Pinterest drawing or something. And I just ran with it. And it was the first thing I wrote that I thought, hey, this could be something. And looking back, what I wrote then at age 14 could not have been something.
Okay. All right.
But it was the seed to grow off of. And it was the first thing I went back to and edited and changed and added and tore it apart and threw it away and did it again and made it better. And it transformed so much. And I think it transformed with me being from 14 years old as a teenager to an adult. I think I published it 2 years ago. So it took over 10 years to solidify. Yeah.
Man, that is crazy. So now let's actually go more in detail about the uh method behind, Blood Covenant and the others that came afterwards. So when you sat down to write Blood Covenant for the Bloodborne series, what goals did you have for yourself going into this? But also, what were your goals or intended promises to your future readers who would pick up this book and the rest in the series?
I think it's a tough one because I my intended promise to my readers is that I will always give them closure with the characters that I write. I can write a lot of characters. I can also keep it very narrow and write about very few characters,
Hmm.
but every single one of them will have an ending to their story, and that could take many forms. That could, even if it's a side character, you're still going to know what's happened to them, either through dialogue of different characters or at a different time, because my series, the first 3 books stand alone and you could read them in any order, but my goal is to have people read them in whatever order they want, but then I want them all to go back and read them again because of the little things that are in there that you will notice,
Okay.
Easter eggs. And so I've written all 4. They're done. They have an ending. There's no waiting 8, 14, 15 years for the final, book in the Game of Thrones trilogy or series. It's done, and every single character has a finale moment, whether it's quiet, whether it's a big, battle kind of ending for them, they will get closure.
Awesome. So when you finished writing uh Blood Covenant and went about the publishing process, or yeah, around that time, did you do any beta readers and ARC readers to get feedback before you said, okay, this book is good and I'm gonna publish it? What was the reaction like? Was it positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle?
So it had a lot of beta readers throughout many, many versions, and there's many versions of Blood Coven that I wish hadn't made it off the laptop. But eventually I fine-tuned it to what I wanted it to be, and I actually initially self-published. And it was self-published under a different title than it is now, which has caused some
Oh, okay.
issues. But I got positive feedback on both, like the original publication and then this revamped, republished, retitled version. Um, I think it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think everyone has a target audience, and my target audience is a lot different than I anticipated, but it I would say most people get what I was trying to say with my story.
That's good. That's always good. And I think, for all authors, that's ultimately one of many goals we want to achieve when we're writing our books, is that our audience understands the intended goal we have with our story. Even if they were not fans of the story, they can at least appreciate, okay, this is what the author was trying to do. And from those interactions and reactions, would you agree that they, in a way, validated your goals that you set out with Blood Coven and the rest of the books in the Bloodbound series?
Yeah, there was some feedback that I got on Blood Coven in particular that I wasn't expecting to get. So I write a story, like there's lots of timelines and lots of characters to follow in Blood Coven, but obviously as a woman, I've never experienced being a male who's abused by his partner. And I wrote that into my story for a variety of reasons. And I got really positive feedback about how well I had written it and that I had done that story justice by somebody who had been in that situation. And that was like shocking to me, but also really validating in that I was able to convey what needed to be conveyed in a respectful way, but also a way that I was able to make an impact on someone.
Wow, that is really, really powerful, Sabrina. And that actually kind of ties perfectly to the next question, which is the first reflective question. Now, as I'm sure you definitely would agree, as you said earlier in the interview, that this a series has taken like a long process to get to this point, and it's not easy. It's hours and hours of editing the first draft, and then hours and hours, if not years, finalizing that to make it the completed draft. Then you're finding a cover artist. Then you're finding an editor. Then you have to format the book exactly the way you want it. You have to then find either a printing service if you want to mass print and sell them locally, or go either independent, traditional, hybrid. All of these things, come into play that ultimately lead to the end goal, which is a published book out on the digital stage. And especially now in the digital world where there are numerous books out there, everyone is showcasing their work. And we'll touch on this later in the business portion. For first time authors who are at that point in their journey when they publish their first story, there's that sense of anxiety and hesitancy if it's going to be received well or not. And probably the biggest thing that a lot of my guests have said on the show, that there's that nervousness as first time authors at that point in their journey, but then also especially when it comes to imposter syndrome, where that is like, for some, it's like a career ender for authors, where they can never move past it, that they take into account the comments and the feedback. And what I mean by that, viewers and listeners, is that yes, for authors, we want to get feedback. We want to grow and improve. And yes, sometimes feedback is critical. Sometimes it is very harsh, but it's also fair. And then you also have the reviews that are just intended to be mean, just to be mean. And unfortunately, it's those reviews that get the most clout that
Yep.
really, really derail an author's self-esteem. So I'm wondering, Sabrina, when you uh, first published Blood Coven, what was the feeling you were experiencing? This sense of like hesitancy, anxiety, and imposter syndrome, and what has disciplined you to continue with this series? Because to you, this is a series that needs to be told and shared with the book community.
I think for me, thankfully, I had already written the entire series before I started publishing. It would have been way too messy to try to wrap up 3 individual books in one final book without having written all of them
Mm,
and being able to go back and change things. And So I'm very thankful for that, because it has been harder to write since publishing. I think I can get in my own head of I have to write for an audience, as opposed to I just write because I like it.
Ah,
I
okay.
think that changes once your book is out there in the world. Um, and it's really important to not think about, I mean, yes, you write for the people who are going to read it, you write for your audience, but you have to write first for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the story I'm telling is a story I wanted to read. That it's as simple as that. It was, I want to read a story that conveys A, B, C, and D. And I tackled all of that and I present it to the world. And if people like it, that's the best I can ask for. If people don't like it, that's fine. I try not to let that get to me, because I've read books that aren't for me, but they're award-winning novels. So
Mm-hmm.
people like them. And it doesn't have to be me who likes it, but I also don't have to be harsh about whether or not
Right.
I didn't like it. And it obviously, reviews are opinions, they're subjective. They're entitled to that review. I appreciate every review that comes in. I think even the negative reviews that have come in, I go, yeah, I could have improved on that. Going forward in my writing career, I will take that information and apply it. We grow so much. I think I like to think I take critique well, in all areas of life, work, writing, just existing as a human.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's a never ending journey. Nobody's ever finished that
Right.
growth, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And you actually touched on something that we will reach towards the end of the interview, which is, sort of like, as you said, writing for ourselves first, and realize, we are the audience, we know first, and, we just have to be, passionate about our story, and, write what we know. Or as one author on my show said, write what you want to write, which we will touch on very soon. So now we're going to turn over to the business side of being an author, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on these set of questions, Sabrina. So first things first, as you mentioned earlier in the interview, that you self-publish Blood Coven under a new name before republishing with the newer edition. So is it fair to say that you are still self-published, or is it more of like a hybrid publish now for the other books?
So I've taken my self-published versions of my novels off. Only two of them made it out into the world, and then I took them down. I submitted my third book to Quill and Crow Publishing House, and they wanted the whole series. So we
Ooh.
started from the beginning, and they're an independent press. So I don't think it's classified as hybrid,
More like a
but
traditional kind of way, even though like a small but
yeah.
still traditional.
Yes, exactly. And so they've really shaped my series into what it can be, as opposed to when I was self-publishing, it was a lot of navigating that world. I hadn't done
Right.
it. I didn't have contacts of people who had done it. So it was a huge learning experience, and it ended up just being financially impossible for me to maintain it. Because, like you mentioned earlier, finding a cover artist, finding an editor, and a good editor is
Hmm.
fine. You got to find someone with credentials and schooling and formatting. That is not my strength. Like, me and an Excel spreadsheet, never gonna happen. Trying to
No.
format a book, I don't think so.
Yeah.
So
That is
finding,
100% true.
yeah, finding a publishing house that is the home for this series has been game changing.
That's really good. And as a little add on to that question, what was sort of the research also going into this company? And the reason I bring this up is that, for authors, when we research publishing houses, whether it's, the large ones that are probably the most well known to the more obscure and small publishing houses, it's always good to research and figure out, okay, what kind of books do these publishing houses push out? And the reason I bring this up is that one of my guests, as you may know, Raven Velasco, she published her story, Blood Triad, or I think it was Blood Triad, or another in her vampire series. And the publishing house that she worked under marketed it as a romance fantasy novel, which there was no romance fantasy. Well, there was no romance in this fantasy world. And as a result, people in the community were not fond of it. And so that comes back to, learning and researching into these houses. So, Sabrina, when you researched and found this company, were you a little hesitant to, talk with them, work out a contract? Because I would imagine there was like maybe a sense of hesitancy if whether or not is this company legitimate? Are they going to treat my book right? Are they going to market my book the way it should be marketed, etc.?
Yeah, just to touch on the marketing piece, it is incredible how important it is to market. When my book came out self-published, I went through a vanity press, so they did all the cover and all that. They published my book as a young adult novel.
Oh
And
no.
the characters, some of them are 17, 18, but there's a lot of things that, because young adult, it goes from like 13 to 18 or something. It was teen, and I was like, this is not okay.
No.
Shouldn't be reading this. So I do know the importance of that, because that you send it to the wrong audience and you're going to be torn apart. But back to your question about the publishing house. So I have a lot of friends in the community who publish throughout. One of them is Jeremy McGargy, and he published a short story with Quill and Crow, and I purchased that anthology with his story in it, and I really enjoyed every story in the book. I enjoyed the cover art. I thought the book was well put together. And then a couple months later, I ended up submitting a short story to one of their calls, one of their anthologies. It was a carnival anthology, and they accepted my story and they edited it really well. I felt like they put it together very nicely, and they were prompt with responses. They were just, everything felt good about it. So then when I decided I wanted to send my series to a publishing house, it was between them and one other, and both of them actually accepted. But Quill and Crow wanted to republish the whole series, and that really just like, that's what sealed it, because every book is going to look the same. Every book is going to be formatted the same and edited by the same editor. And I went, that's what I need. I can't have, two books self-published and then two books published with a different publishing house.
Definitely. So am I to assume that Quill and Crow is almost like a Gothic I'm not a Gothic publication house, like dark fantasy, a little bit of thriller and something like that?
Yeah, so they mainly publish Gothic fiction, but also horror, dark fantasy, and I do believe they have a sub-publishing house for like dark romance as well.
That definitely sounds like another one that my friend actually owns herself, Curious Corvid. Very much same thing. I'm getting the same kind of vibes, which is awesome. And going back to what you said earlier about, marketing to, the right audience, that is actually the next question, which is the audience. And the audience is very, very important, viewers and listeners, because as I said before, we are the target audience first and foremost when it comes to our books. But when it comes to readers who want to read it for themselves, we have to take into account, okay, what genre or subgenre does this book fall under? And from there, it comes with own, words, tropes, themes, etc. And yes, you're not going to be 100% sure it's going to hit the target audience, but you want to at least get the good amount. So for you, Sabrina, with all four of your books, do you at least have a good idea of your audience? And in your opinion, when should the author take into account the audience when writing their story?
I I think I thought my audience was different than what I got. And
Mm,
that surprised me. So I mean, it's a Blood Coven, being the first book in the series, is about a group of young women who start a coven in the woods, and then there's a sub story with witches in the past. To me, I was like, this is feminist female literature. The only people who are going to want to read it are women. I was
right.
so wrong. It was so well received by men, and I was shocked. Some men didn't enjoy it as much because they felt like it had maybe too much feminist to it, but I think they missed the point of the book. I think they missed an element of, this is a time in history where women didn't have any rights. So,
Mm,
I don't write all negative men. I don't write all negative towards men. I have a lot of male characters that are very good people, and they have their story told throughout as well. And I do think I've done justice to those male characters. But I think some people perceived it as, oh, this is an I hate men book, which is
okay.
not the point, not what I was trying to do. There's awful women in these books. There's awful men, but there's also really good men and there's really good women. So I think they just missed the point. But I was surprised how many men did receive this book with such positive feedback.
Nice. That's actually really good. And we're actually going to touch onto that when it comes to the readership. But before that, I had another question I wanted to ask you, Sabrina. So, in the interviews that I had in the beginning when I first started podcasting, there was one question that I had, which was, of course, who are the authors who helped mold you into the author you are now, who helped found your author of voice? And I always liked that question because it allowed, my guests to talk about their favorite authors and allow me to discover new ones. But one guest I had earlier this year kind of flipped that question on its head and instead offered a different answer. And he gave a little context for this, which is, as I'm sure you have seen books like this, Sabrina, where it has like the tagline, so and so meets so and so. And from a reader's perspective, that grabs our attention. Even if we've never read those authors, we at least have an idea of the books they've written. And when we go into that book, we expect the book to act or be in that same realm for the two authors. But from an author's perspective, that comparison's not really helpful because, in a way, it kind of puts us in a little box that we can only write this kind of genre or write these type of stories. Authors are very, very versatile, and we want to, yes, show reverence and respect to the stories that helped us find our voice, but also allowing us to show our individuality because we don't want to replicate, we don't want to imitate, we're not trying to be the next so and so, because there will never be another so and so. There'll never be a George R. R. Martin, C.S. Lewis, Stephen King, Frank Herbert's Dune, or anybody. We want to be our own. So for you, Sabrina, ultimately, here is the question. When you were writing this series, these four books, how did you balance the two, your individuality as an author, while also harkening back to the stories that you grew up with?
It's a loaded question. I think I think we draw so much inspiration from everything around us, whether it's people, experiences you've had, books you've read, movies you've watched. We're a combination, like a cocktail of all these things that have made us who we are, right? And you draw from that. So even if you are writing inspired by Stephen King, Anne Rice, etc., no matter how hard you try to be like them or write like them, you're still going to bring in your little nuances, your little idiosyncrasies into your writing, and it's always going to make it different. And I enjoy a comparable. I picked up a book because it said The Handmaid's Tale meets Alice in Wonderland. And I was like,
Right.
sold. But I do also find it hard to find comparables for like my own books, because I just write them because they come to me. My characters suddenly exist in my head. There's a scene or a piece of dialogue that just comes to me, and I don't know where it comes from. It's like they exist in a parallel universe and they just whisper something to me, and I have to run with it. I have to see where I can take those characters. And obviously I pull from other things I've watched, read, seen, etc., because you can't not, no matter how hard you try. I think one time I ended up writing a line and I went, that's a really good line, but feels like I've heard it before.
I know exactly the same feeling.
It was a line from Harry Potter. And I was like, okay, get that out of there. That can't be in there. But so, inevitably we pull from the things we've heard before, even if it's a phrase, a common turn of phrase, but you're always going to have your individual spin on it. And obviously nobody wants to plagiarize.
Right.
Nobody wants to. Having written stories based on fairy tales, they're going to have some things that are true to those stories. But fairy tales have been twisted and changed and altered throughout history. It's almost like they are a core version of storytelling that is meant to be branched off of. It's almost like fan fiction in a way, actually, now that I think about it. Do I write fairy tale fan fiction? I think I do. But yeah, I think we'll always pull from the things we know, and that's what makes our stories different from the next person. No one's going to write a fully original vampire.
Yes.
Vampires have been done for centuries. Even before the first written vampire story of Carmilla, you have spoken word stories about vampires. You have myth and lore in other cultures. But a vampire movie that came out last month could be so original compared to, Bram Stoker's Dracula. But it still originates from the concept of a story that already exists.
Definitely, 100%. And I'm actually glad you brought up, fairy tales have always been, retold and changed over time, because it definitely leads into a discussion I want to have with you. And I'm gonna make a comparison to probably the most iconic and probably most well-known revisionist story, which is Wicked, which is based off of I almost said Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz. But the reason I bring this up, viewers and listeners, is that for those who don't know, Wicked is a revisionist story. It has some characters from Wizard of Oz, but they are unique and original to that own story and to the author. They are the original characters. They just given a new appearance or a new background. So I was wondering for you, Sabrina, is like, how do you feel about being classified as a revisionist author? Because as you mentioned earlier, your stories are alternate versions of classic and fairy tales. And as a fun question, what other fairy tale stories would you like to give your own spin to them?
Well, I've done Red Riding Hood. I've done Snow White, kind of, Little Mermaid, and then the fourth one doesn't actually follow a fairy tale. at all, because it's kind of all of them combined. I
Hmm.
think it would be really fun to do Beauty and the Beast, but I also feel like
Ooh.
it's been done so much in like dark romance fantasy. I'm sure it's been done 1,000 times with like werewolf tropes and what have you. So I feel like I'm not prepared to take on those. Um, but I also feel like because this series is complete, no other fairy tales have really spoken to me. Oh, except I did do a short story based on the Pied Piper.
Ooh, I like that. I like that.
Yeah, and I pull from history too, so I'll read into the origins of a short story or of a myth. And I read something about, it was for a creative writing course, and it was this dancing illness where everyone would dance, and like it becomes almost like a folie à deux where everyone is kind of having the same insanity. And there was a group of children that just disappeared, and people had this suspicion that it was, they all followed this Pied Piper and danced until they all died or something like that. It was horrifying, but it was really fun to take, okay, here's this mystery from history that doesn't have conclusion, and here's a fairy tale. Let me put them together.
Ooh, that's good. That's
Yeah.
really, really good. That actually kind of reminds me of, I think I saw a film from a friend of mine, almost kind of the same thing. I think it was from Shudder, where they took the Pied Piper story, but they brought it into like a more modern setting where it's like this kind of demon or spirit that had a flute and it was taking the children, but the music was changing the children. The one child who survived and didn't turn had hearing loss. She was deaf. She couldn't hear the music. She just followed along. So when the piper was playing more intensely, the music was having no effect on her. So that is, you know, really, really fascinating. And as the add on to that question, what are your thoughts on like being like called or being labeled as like a revisionist author, or do you just see yourself as just an author, not as the and author title?
Yeah, nobody's put that label on me, and neither have I. I wrote this fantasy series so long ago, and yes, it's still being published, and those things take time.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also written in the genre of rom-com, teen
Ooh.
fiction, and am currently writing like very, very dark romance right now.
Ooh. Okay.
I think Ashen Heart was the stepping stone for me to realize that I could write that. And then um, this following book that's not connected to anything, it's a standalone, is me fully embracing a different genre.
Nice, very nice. And now, going to the next question, which is a callback to what you were talking about earlier about your first publishing experience through a vanity publishing who published your story as young adult when it was not young adult whatsoever. This now comes down to the readership, and readership is very, very important. And as you said earlier in the interview, your readership has been, significantly different than what you anticipated, which is always good. Because
Mhm.
I think you can agree, Sabrina, there are certain books that are marketed, let's say in either, well, let's actually focus on young adult because this actually is a good example, that are marketed as young adult, but upon reading them, you realize this needed another revision because this is not young adult. And that mainly comes down to the spiciness between the
Yeah.
characters. And that's another thing when it comes to honing your craft as an author. It's like, okay, if I'm going to write either young adult, new adult, or adult, I got to understand, okay, the language has to make sense. It has to match the tone of the characters, tone of the story, etc. So for you, Sabrina, it kind of feels like that your book is like towards the adult fiction. So how difficult was it to where, yes, this is in the adult fiction, but I don't want it to be repulsive. I want it to be, you know, mature enough to where it talks about these topics, but at the end of the day, it's still an enjoyable story that readers can understand.
I think I I write with the intent to tell my character's story. And if that some of their stories are not going to have the same level of horror or spice, there's no spice in the first book. It's mostly about a group of, 17 to 25-year-old girls. There's just not, it's not the story for that.
Right.
Whereas the second book, I definitely marketed as a lot more spice forward. It's not super spicy. I don't want anyone going into it thinking it's like, five chili peppers.
Right.
But it would definitely, along with that, there's an element of spice throughout the book. There's also substantially darker elements of horror in it because all the characters in it are adults. So
Right.
it lends itself to a story of more mature themes. And Blood Coven has, themes of abuse and, taking back your autonomy from your abusers, that sort of thing. Some horrifying things in there, but the characters that are harmed are often the ones who, not always, but the ones who deserve it, right?
Mm.
Whereas in Ashen Heart, I'm writing from the point of view of a villain.
Oh, I like that.
Doing the harm. And the people who are being harmed maybe don't deserve it. And so it was a totally different writing experience. And I was also a lot older when I wrote it. So I think kind of plays with it too. I was more experienced as a human being to know how dark I wanted to go with the writing.
Right, definitely. And especially when it comes to like these very adult and mature themes and stories, there has to be, a balance where it's like, okay, I don't want to, make it like very much like a fantasy or like a fetish, whatever the topic is. But I definitely don't want to play it down. There's almost like this teeter-totter balance where you're showing respect to the situation, but you're also seeing, there's a way to escape from whatever is happening, whether it's, abuse, uh, drug addiction, or anything that would be classified as triggering. And that comes again with, time honing one's craft to really understand, okay, for this story, this is how it's going to go. And for that story, that's going to go. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to just add something just to get a reaction from your audience, because they're going to know that it's not authentic, in the sense that you just shoehorned it in just to get like, the gravy train or the tropes or something, because that's going to, in a way, discredit your brand as an author. Because another thing too we need to talk about is, for us authors, we are building our brand through our stories. It's from these stories that, readers can get an idea of some facet of our personality, in terms of like what stories we like to write about, what type of characters we like to explore. That's not necessarily to say that these are the only types of characters or stories we like to write about. Of course, we want to be versatile, but through the stories that we are most known for, it gives our readers an idea. And this, of course, leads to a very important discussion, which I really want to hear your thoughts on, Sabrina. So before that, I'll add some context to this question, because this is a very, very loaded question, probably the most loaded question in my interview. So when I started doing podcasting, I want to say back in 2018, I just did it for my author friends and I on Inkit. And from there, that just snowballed into meeting historians, because I'm also an historian by trade, and learning from them, learning about their backgrounds, what they've worked on, projects, etc. And then from there, I got to meet new authors, sometimes authors who were published with some of my favorite houses, whose books I have on the shelves. And when I started YouTube 2 years ago, that was a whole new avenue. But I got to meet so many wonderful and incredible people from different periods of their lives, writing different stories. And it's been so, so incredible. And from these interactions, I want to say, even though I've done 200 something videos, I've interviewed almost 100 authors on the show thus far. And from what I've learned from these 90 something authors is that there's two paths for authors: to be an author and to be known as an author. And for me, to be an author is an individual dedicated to the art of storytelling, crafting the narrative, and not being motivated by capital. But let's be honest, it's nice to get a little money now and then to help fund our next projects. And the second one, to be known as an author, is an individual dedicated to marketing, promoting their works on social media, going on podcasts such as these to get the word out, to get their name out. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We all want to be known as authors. But realistically, especially for first-time authors who are just getting their foot in the door, I've noticed, and a lot of my guests agree, that the second path is the most enticing. But that leads to unrealistic goals and expectations. And that leads to a lack of passion, where you're not writing because you enjoy it. You're writing because you want to join the next hype train. You want to join the next clicks, trends, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned is, in this industry, there's no guarantee your first book is going to give you the gratification and status that you want. It's not impossible to achieve, but if you're expecting overnight success, that's not realistic. There are exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
There are authors whose first works did get them award-winning status, and that is an impossible feat to do, and they should get all the praise because they deserve it. But realistically, for other authors, you have this roller coaster of going up and down. And that's the moment when authors realize that they're no longer passionate about writing, and they no longer pick up the quill, go to the computer. They've lost their passion because they turn their passion into a job. Not to say writing isn't a job. What I'm merely saying is that they were writing just to join. Okay, what's the most popular book series right now? Oh, I'm going to use Fourth Wing as an example because everyone keeps mentioning that book. They want to write a book that's similar to Fourth Wing to get those readers. Okay, let's say you do, and you do produce a book. Well, here's the other side. That trend's already gone, and your book's now in the wind. That's even also for small small publishing houses too, because they have to take into consideration if this book is marketable, because they have to sell a product. And ultimately, as I've said before, in this industry, there is no guarantee that your first book is going to give you that success, but it should not deter you on your path to being a great storyteller, because as we talked about before, you only get better as time goes on. So, Sabrina, after the long build up to this question, what is your thoughts and opinions on this topic in the industry, which it is important to bring awareness to, especially for first-time authors who are watching this interview?
Well, first off, I want to say that capitalism kills art.
Yeah.
So don't get it in your head that your art, if it's not making you money, doesn't mean that it's not still art.
Right.
I think that it's very important to remember why you're writing or creating or painting, whatever your art is. remember why you're doing it and hone in on the feelings it's causing you. If it's causing you anxiety, something's amiss, right?
Right.
I think what I've learned in the last, I don't know, 5 years probably, was that I write my best when I am in my worst. I think it's,
Mm.
the artist's curse is that, we're all depressed and struggle with things. But I definitely channeled so much of my emotional processes into my writing because it's so much easier to process it as fiction. You
Right.
give a character your problems, all of a sudden you know how to process your problems. I've read back on stuff I've written in the past and gone, whoa, okay, I went through that, but I dealt with it by writing. I'm in a
Right.
really good state right now in my life. Like, little is going not great. So I don't write as much because I don't have this like emotional turmoil tornado inside of me that I need to get out in some capacity, which is great, but I'm not writing as much. But I'm not doing it for money. I mean, I have a day job. I think most authors, most creators are creating outside of their 9 to 5 or their,
Yes.
10 to 3, whatever. And I want my stories out there. I want people to read them because they want to. If I make money, awesome. But at the end of the day, that's not my goal. And if I make that my goal, I know a lot of authors have figured out algorithms and TikTok and all that. I can't burn that wick. I can't. It's not for me. I know marketing's important. It's a hard thing for me. I prefer marketing in the sense of go do a signing, go do a podcast. It comes a lot more naturally to me than, okay, I need to make 30 posts so I'm prepped for the month. I can't do that.
No. Same here.
My
I can't.
ADHD doesn't let me do that. I'll hyperfixate. I'll do a couple of things in one go, and then I'll try to space it out to give myself some time. But I shut down from the marketing side of it, from the social media side of it. But I've also seen very successful authors and artists who aren't heavy on their social media. Don't spend all your time on the social media side of it because there's no more time left for the creative side of it at that point.
That is actually really, really true. And I'm actually glad you brought that up, Serena, because it is true. Because for us, creators and artists, we do get hyperfixated on the social media because you always see what's trending, what's popular, especially in the book world, that we sometimes forget it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're not trying to be like everyone else. And as I said before, grit transforms into talent, and we only get better as time goes on. And it may be your 10th book, your 15th book, your 20th book that really gets your name out there and allows you to achieve everything you wanted and more. Well, congratulations, because now you can tell your fan base, hey, if you've enjoyed this book, check out the other ones to see my growth as an author. Because at the end of the day, for all of us authors, we're all going to be gone, one day or another. And the words we leave behind will exist in our books. That may be a little grim or gloomy to say, viewers and listeners, but it's true. At the end of the day, our words are going to outlive us. Because that's why we still have Tolkien. That's why we have Frank Herbert's Dune. That's why we have Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's why we have these great literacy stories that exist and are now immortal. And I think that's probably a very beautiful thing to really, really take into consideration. And kind of to meander away from the gloominess of this little add-on, as we near the end of this interview, I did have two final questions, Sabrina, that I wanted to ask you. The first is one that I think you've touched on, but maybe you can go more in details. So, as authors, we've talked about, inspirations from the books we read, but what's also important to take into account are the authors that we have met either in person or social media, and learning from them and seeing what can we take their strategies and implement it into our arsenal. So are there any authors that you would like to give a personal shout out to who have really helped you hone your voice as an author when you began this journey of yours?
Yes. I mean, the list is huge. Coming in from, I think being a writer is very much an individual and isolating process, but it doesn't have to be.
Mm-mm.
There's parts of it where you're going to be completely on your own, and you have to be okay with that. But there's parts of it where you are going to have people cheering you on the whole way. And coming onto social media with an author presence in 2020, like right in the thick of COVID, weird times, I kind of went in going, okay, fantasy, that's what I write. The fantasy crew was not my people. They didn't
Mm.
receive me well. And then the horror community went, here, you're coming with us. And I found my target friends as opposed to a target audience. And they initially became my target audience as well. But Jillian Duwell, Jeremy McGargy, I've mentioned earlier, Stephanie Kemmler, who you interviewed the other week, I think, Brooklyn Dean, Vivian Rain, Alexander Michael, Kate Gately, Dove Kavanaugh King, my little writing group that I have in town here. They have every single one of them has been there for me in different capacities that have shaped me as an author, as a writer, as a marketer, what have you. And everyone who kind of has helped me, I hope I'm helping as well.
Right.
Because it's give and get, right? Like if some of them have been betas for me, some of them haven't. I've been betas for some of them, but I've also learned so much from their writing, particularly Jillian Duwell, Stephanie Kemmler, and Brooklyn Dean. They've broken some boundaries in writing that I didn't know you could break.
Right.
And I'm not trying to write like them. I'm not trying to, as we talked about earlier, I'm not trying to replicate their writing style, but the feeling I get from reading their books, I want to be able to give that feeling to other people. And it doesn't mean I'm writing the same as them. I'm writing the same as me, but I hope I can convey those same really deep emotions that stick with you when you finish reading the book.
Right.
It's not going to be the same as another author, but if I can get to one reader who perceives it the way I've perceived these authors' books, that's a win for me. That's more than royalties. That's more than anything.
I have to agree. And, I'm very, very much of, like mine. When I began also around COVID back in 2020, I was still in college. I was doing my master's degree and I was in San Francisco. And when they told us we had to leave, I had to come back here to Southern California. And, I began writing, and the sense of community for me, it came about later in my journey when I, discovered social media and realized there's a lot of authors on Instagram. And from there, it just snowballed. And, I've met some incredible people from Daisy Vander, Kim Applegram, Eric Bowden, Gregory Amato, Candace Costello, and there's so many authors. I'm sorry if I can list all of you, but you guys are really, really incredible. Oh, Amer Saleh, Rachel Beck, uh, so many others. It's incredible. And, just like how the horror group for you was like, this family, this circle of people that really understood you. For me, it was like the fantasy and history group that really uh, felt close to me. And I've learned so much from them. And I'm sure you agree that you've learned a lot from people in the horror community, that we've really grown, not just as authors, but as people. And that leads to the final question of this interview, Sabrina, which is this: with everything you've learned thus far and continuing forward on this journey of yours, what is your word of wisdom
Hmm.
to authors who are watching this video or listening to it right now?
Okay, yes. So I feel like everyone's answer to this is always write every day or just finish the book you're writing. When you finished it, you know, you'll be able to reflect on it. You can't edit an unfinished book.
Right.
Those are all really good pieces of advice, but I think what something I've learned in the past year or two is don't be afraid to write what scares you. Like just try it. You're
Ooh,
not
I like that.
sure, if you're not sure about it, the worst outcome is that you file it away into your file. The best outcome is that you've branched out completely out of your comfort zone and you get to discover a whole new side of yourself and your writing. And I think that applies to writing and to life, because if you don't take risks, this is going to sound cheesy, no risk, no reward, but it's true.
Right.
There is a scene in Song of the Sea where I was like, this is stupid. I'm going to write it. I've had so many comments about that chapter. And it was something that a different version of me would have said, no, I don't like that idea, figure something else out. And it might have been a way worse chapter, but it was silly and I ran with it. It didn't scare me necessarily, but I'm more writing content that scares me. Whereas back then I was writing content that was Song of the Sea is a wholesome book. So it
Right.
was this silly concept of a mermaid wearing clothing. And it just bonded these characters way stronger together. And it's an impactful chapter and people commented on it and I went, whoa, okay, I achieved something by taking a risk.
Absolutely. And I love that. Write what scares you, because I know from personal experience that I've done that as well. I actually wrote a short story, my first horror short story, werewolf short story called Hellhounds. And it was about the Battle of Belleau Woods in 1916 between the Germans and the Marines. And I talk about, the Marines, beat the Germans, and they were described as being vicious and brutal to the German soldiers. But I added a little line that says, what they don't tell you is why. And so in this short story, 2,000 words, I crafted a narrative that the Marine Corps were werewolves and the
Love
German
it.
army was completely eviscerated, but they had no word for werewolves. So they called them Hollenhundes, hellhounds, which is what the Germans did call the Marines during World War One. And since then, a lot of people have asked me, are you going to turn this into a full-on novel? And I am playing with the idea, but going back to what you said, write what scares you. I didn't know I could write horror. I was a little intimidated by it because I didn't know. But from that interaction, I realized, okay, I can write horror and I can write short stories, because that's always been the thing for me. I can't write, or I thought I could never write short stories. I like to write long ones. But
Mhm.
from this, I know that I can. And just to tie it all neatly, going back to what we talked about, from these experiences, writing what you know and writing what scares you, all of this comes to what we mentioned, which is your growth as an author, my viewers and listeners. Because at the end of the day, just like as we ourselves grow, if we continue to train ourselves, push beyond our limits, and see what we're capable of in our writing, we're going to be surprised. Because at the end of the day, as I said, our words are going to outlive us. So why not try and experiment and see what we can do with the time we have? Wow, that was really, really depressing. I did not mean to do that. But with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing late night author interview here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to Sabrina for coming on the show. And, we wish her the very best going forward. Sabrina, thank you so very, very much. where can people find you on social media, and where can people go and purchase copies of your books?
Well, first off, thank you again for having me on here. And I did like that we ended on a little macabre note. It might not be October, but I think all of winter is about like end of things and death and all that. So it's still spooky. It's still spooky. I am on the regular places, Facebook, Instagram. I do have a website. I'm s.voerman on Instagram, and then Sabrina Voerman author everywhere else. I'm not very responsive on Facebook, and my website's more just for like kind of a hub. But if anyone reaches out to me on Instagram, that's where I'm the most active. I will shut down and not be on it for a month or two, but that's only when I burn out. So,
Right.
yeah, pretty much you can find me there. If you are looking to purchase any of my books, they're on Amazon. They're available on Quill and Crow's website. I always recommend to people request it from your library because they will get them in and then it's free, and everybody loves free books. So I've been requesting them with my library. So hopefully you guys can request them with yours too. They're also available ebooks and audiobooks. So if anybody's prefers listening, and they are fairy tales, so spoken word is really good for those kinds of stories. They're available on Audible.
Excellent. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for a late night author interview for the month of November. Again, a huge thank you to Sabrina for coming out here on the show, and we wish her the best going forward on her author's journey, and we can't wait to see what she has in store for the rest of us. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. And as a bonus, comment down below what is your favorite horror story, either novel or short story, and let us know down below. As always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world.